So today's topic is biosynthetic pathways. So biosynthetic pathways means biosynthetic and pathways, right? So pathways which explains about the synthesis of metabolites or chemical constituents or any organic compounds within the living organisms. Living bio means living organisms. So here the biosynthetic pathways means, so these are the pathways which explains about the synthesis of metabolites or chemical compounds within the living organisms, right? So getting into the introduction, biosynthesis. Okay, biosynthesis is also known as anabolism since the simple compounds are joined together to form the macromolecules, and this process is catalyzed by the enzymes. Okay, so what is the function of enzymes? These enzymes, they enhances the rate of reactions. Okay, so these are the biomolecules which enhances the rate of reaction. So here what happens? The simple compounds are joined together and forms a macromolecules. Okay, so these are known as biosynthesis. So biosynthesis, it is a process of forming larger organic compounds from small subunits within a living organism. This is nothing but same. Okay, so here the small subunits combines together and forms larger organic compounds. Okay, so where it is happening? This happens within this living organisms. Okay, so the synthesis of organic compounds within the living organisms is known as biosynthesis. Biosynthesis is a biological process and it is catalyzed by the enzymes. Biosynthesis, it occurs within the living organisms. Okay, so this whole points, the summary of these 4 points is: biosynthesis is a process in which the small subunits or the precursors are combined to form larger molecules. Okay, so we have an example: erythrose 4-phosphate and phosphoenol pyruvate. Okay, these two small subunits, okay, these are the intermediates of pentose phosphate pathway and glycolysis. Okay, so these two subunits, they combine together and forms the shipmic acid. Okay, so in the same way, the small subunits, they combine together and forms the larger organic compounds, and all these reactions are catalyzed by enzymes. Okay, they are catalyzed by enzymes and all these reactions occurs within the living organisms. Whereas biogenesis means it is the development of life from the pre-existing life. Okay, so next, coming to the definition of biosynthesis, biosynthesis is defined as building up of complex chemical compounds, simpler ones, by a series of reactions catalyzed by enzymes in the cells during the physiological process of a living organisms. Okay, so the biosynthesis, it happens during the physiological processes of a living organism. Okay, so here what happens is building up of complex chemical compounds from the simpler ones. Okay, so the simple or small subunits, they combine together or they involve in the reactions and builds up the complex chemical compounds. Okay, so in this happens by a series of chemical reactions. Okay, so there is a number of chemical reactions takes place in between. Okay, so the chemical compounds formed during that series of reactions are known as intermediates. Okay, so the smaller subunits or simpler compounds, they combine together or they involve in the reaction and forms the complex chemical compounds in the presence of enzymes, which are present in the cells of that living organisms. Okay, the enzymes of this enzymes present in the cells of the living organisms, they will involve, means they will catalyze the reactions. Okay, so here for this biosynthesis of any metabolites, we require the precursors. Okay, generally the precursors which you can find in the biosynthetic pathways are ATP and NADH, NADPH, FADPH and FADH. Okay, so ATP means adenosine triphosphate and NADH means nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. Okay, and NADPH means nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. Okay, so it is a cofactor, and flavin adenine dinucleotide and flavin adenine dinucleotide phosphate. Okay, so these two are the coenzymes. Okay, so enzymes means which involve in the which catalyzes the reactions or which enhances the rate of reactions, whereas the coenzymes are essential for the they are the non-protein compounds which are necessary for the proper functioning of the enzymes. And we also have cofactors. Cofactors are nothing but the helper molecules. Okay, so here the cofactors are NADH and NADPH. Okay, coenzymes FADPH, FADH. Next. Generally, the compounds generated via biosynthesis are carbohydrates. These are some of the examples of the compounds which are synthesized. Compounds are products of biosynthetic pathways. Carbohydrates, it is a primary metabolite. Proteins, primary metabolite. Vitamins, antibiotics, fats, alkaloids, glycosides, tannins, resins. All these can be synthesized in the living organisms. Okay, so these are some of the examples of the compounds which are generated via biosynthesis. Next, so by far the most important building blocks employed in the biosynthesis of secondary metabolites are derived from the intermediates. Okay, so most of the generally the secondary metabolites have the pharmacological action. Okay, they are medicinally they are very important. So if you see the biosynthetic pathways of the secondary metabolites, they are derived from some intermediates. Okay, so the intermediates which are involved in most of the secondary metabolites are acetyl coenzyme A, acetyl CoA, shikimic acid, mevalonic acid, and deoxyxylulose 5-phosphate. Okay, so this acetyl CoA, mevalonic acid, they involve in the acetate pathway, that is acetyl mevalonic acetate pathway, and shikimic acid involved in the shikimic acid pathway. And so here we have two pathways, acetate mevalonic acid pathway and acetate malonate pathway. Okay. So, coming to the differences between the primary metabolites and secondary metabolites. Okay, so before going into the differences between the primary metabolites and secondary metabolites, primary metabolites are the initial compounds. Okay, so here you can see it is there in the second point. They are the primary compounds. Okay, so prime means first compounds. Okay, so they are directly generated in the living organism. They are the primary compounds. Secondary compounds means the compounds which are derived from the primary metabolites. Okay, this is the first difference. Okay, primary compounds, primary metabolites are the primary compounds or first compounds or initial compounds which are synthesized within the living organisms, whereas the secondary metabolites are the compounds which are derived from the primary metabolites. Okay, so coming to the second difference, the primary metabolites are simple in nature. Okay, whereas the secondary metabolites are complex in nature. Primary metabolites are simple in nature, and secondary metabolites are complex in nature. Coming to the distribution, primary metabolites are widely distributed in nature. Okay, they are distributed in all organisms. Okay, you can see the carbohydrates. Okay, so they are widely distributed in nature. And coming to the secondary metabolites, they are more limited in distribution, and they are restricted to taxonomic group. If you see the alkaloids comes under secondary metabolites, tannins comes under secondary metabolites, and glycosides, okay, it also comes under secondary metabolites. Okay, if you see the distribution, all the plants will not have the alkaloids, all the plants will not have the same amount of glycosides, right? So the distribution is restricted to some taxonomic group. Okay, so volatile oils are there. Volatile oils are also, they are restricted to some taxonomic groups. They are not present in all the plants or animals, right? So the distribution, primary metabolites are widely distributed in nature and they are distributed in all organisms, whereas the secondary metabolites, they are more limited in distribution and they are restricted to some taxonomic groups, right? So next, coming to the extraction procedure, the isolation process of primary metabolites is easy and non-expensive. Whereas in case of secondary metabolites, the process is difficult and it is expensive compared to the primary, right? So the best example for this primary metabolites is starch. Okay, starch, it is present in the potatoes, okay, maize, and also wheat, right? So when you go for the isolation of starch from potato, okay, so the process is very simple and very easy, and it's also non-expensive, right? So directly we'll make a juice of it and then we will strain it and we'll go for the sedimentation process. Okay, if you go for if you keep it aside, then the starch present in the solution, it will settle down. Okay, so it is a very simple process and it is a non-expensive. Okay, and coming to the secondary metabolites, here you can see the extraction of caffeine from the tea powder or coffee seeds. Okay, so there you have to go for the you have to use the extraction procedure, that is decoction, and then you have to remove the tannins, and then again you have to go for the extraction, liquid extraction by using separating funnel and chloroform, right? So after that you will get the small quantity of caffeine. Okay, so it is an expensive process. We have equipment like Soxalate and Clavenger apparatus, right? So Clavenger's apparatus, it is an example for hydrodistillation, right? So it is mainly used in the isolation of volatile oils, and we'll be using Soxalate. So it is an expensive process. Okay, the isolation of secondary metabolites is an expensive process, and the process, it is difficult compared to the primary metabolites. And next, coming to the yield. Okay, so the primary metabolites are present in larger quantities in the plants, whereas coming to the secondary metabolites, they are present in smaller quantities. Okay, so after extraction, if you check the yield of primary metabolites and the secondary metabolites, the yield of primary metabolites will be more. Okay, so whereas the secondary metabolites, it will be very less compared to the primary metabolites. Okay, so they are present in larger quantities, whereas the secondary metabolites, they are present in smaller quantities. Next point. So they produce the same products in every species. Primary metabolites, they produce same products in every species, whereas secondary metabolites, we have various types, right? So they are restricted to some taxonomic groups. So each species will have different types of secondary metabolites. Okay, they produce different products in every species. Okay, digitalis purpurea is there. Okay, so purpurea glycosides, right? So digitalis lanata is there. Different species, lanatocytes are present. Okay, so they produce different products in the every species, whereas in case of primary metabolites, they produce the same products in every species. Next point. So generally, this occurs during the growth phase, and the secondary metabolites occurs at the stationary phase. Okay. And coming to the function, the primary metabolites, they directly involve in the growth, development and reproduction, whereas the secondary metabolites, they support the cells indirectly. They will not involve in the growth or development or reproduction process. Okay, so they just gives they supports the cells indirectly, maybe by providing protection. Okay, so thereby it helps in sustaining life for longer. Okay, and it has the economic importance. Okay, thereby helps in sustaining life for longer economic importance. Primary metabolites, they involve in the growth, development and reproduction, whereas the secondary metabolites, they supports the cells indirectly, but they will not involve in the growth, development and reproduction. And the last point, so coming to primary metabolites, they do not have any biological or pharmacological action. Okay, they might be involving in the growth and development of the living organisms, but they do not possess any pharmacological or medicinal properties. Whereas secondary metabolites, they possess marked biological or pharmacological actions. Okay, so they have the medicinal properties. All the secondary metabolites, mostly they have the pharmacological activity, right? So if you see the examples, quinine, it is isolated from the cinchona bark. It has anti-malarial activity. And we also have caffeine, it is isolated from tea dust or coffee seeds, so it has CNS stimulant activity. So we also have vinca and vincristin and blastin isolated from vinca. Okay, so it has anti-cancer activity. Same way we have reserpine, it is isolated from rauwolfia, so it has anti-hypertensive activity. So mostly, so all these are the secondary metabolites, all caffeine, quinine, reserpine, vincristin, vinblastin, all these are secondary metabolites which has medicinal properties. Okay, if you say the carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, all these are primary metabolites. They are essential for the growth and development, but they do not have the medicinal properties. Okay, so these are the differences between the primary and secondary metabolites. Moving on to the next slide. Metabolic pathway. So what do you mean by metabolic pathway? Okay, so all these biosynthetic pathways are the metabolic pathways. Metabolic pathway means it is the reaction sequence occurring within the organism in an orderly and regulated way known as metabolic pathway. Okay, so here the reaction sequence is occurring within the organisms in an orderly, regulated way. Okay, so that process is known as metabolic pathway. So this involves both the synthesis as well as breakdown of molecules. Metabolic pathways, it includes both the synthesis as well as breakdown of molecules, right? So it is a series of enzyme catalyzed chemical reactions which takes place inside the living organism. This is what we have discussed initially, right? So biosynthetic pathways are the metabolic pathways. Okay, so all these reaction sequences occurs within the organisms, right? And these are catalyzed by the enzymes. Okay, so for example, So if you take this as a pathway, right? So here this is the starting material and this is the end product. Okay, so we have A, B, C and D, right? So this acts as a precursor, right? And this is our end product. Either it may be a primary metabolite or maybe the secondary metabolite, right? So this is known as reactant or precursor or starting material. Okay, so from here we are getting the B. Okay, so from A we are getting B, and from B we are getting C, and from C we are getting the final product D, right? So in between the reactant and product, so we got two more products, that is B and C. So these compounds are known as intermediates. Okay, so here in the biosynthetic pathways, a series of reactions are taking place. Okay, so during the series of reactions, these intermediates are formed. Okay, from these intermediates finally we will get the product. Okay, so the compounds which are formed in between are known as intermediates or metabolites. So this is a diagrammatic representation of all the biosynthetic different pathways. Okay, so here you can see pentose phosphate pathway, erythrose 4-phosphate is obtained. Okay, erythrose 4-phosphate is the intermediate of pentose phosphate pathway, and phosphoenol pyruvate, it is obtained from the glycolysis. Okay, so these two intermediates, erythrose 4-phosphate and phosphoenol pyruvate, these two acts as a starting materials or precursors in the shikimic acid pathway. Okay, so pentose phosphate pathway, so here formation of carbohydrates. Okay, synthesis of carbohydrates, right? So during lysis, okay, so I already told you biosynthetic pathways are the metabolic pathway which involves both the synthesis as well as breakdown. So here the synthesis is taking place, right? And also breakdown, it also involves breakdown. Glycolysis means lysis, breakdown of glucose molecules. The carbohydrate undergoes glycolysis. Okay, so during this process the phosphoenol pyruvate is formed. Okay, so it gives the pyruvic acid, right? So the phosphoenol pyruvate is an intermediate. Okay, it involves in the shikimic acid pathway. Okay, both the erythrose 4-phosphate, phosphoenol pyruvate, they involve in the shikimic acid pathway. They forms the shikimic acid, and which ultimately gives aromatic amino acids. It undergoes transamination and forms aromatic amino acids, from which we get different types of amino acids, alkaloids, different types of alkaloids from the aromatic amino acids, right? So aromatic amino acids examples are phenylalanine, tyrosine and tryptophan. Okay, so from these three amino acids we get different types of alkaloids. Okay, next pyruvic acid, it ultimately forms acetyl CoA. So acetyl CoA, it involves in acetate pathway. Okay, so I already told you we have two pathways, that is acetate malonate pathway and acetate mevalonate pathway. Okay, these are the two acetate pathways. Okay, so here malonyl CoA is involved along with the acetyl CoA, right? So this pathway mainly helps in the synthesis of fatty acids, polyketides. Okay, whereas acetyl CoA on the other hand, it combines with the mevalonic acid and it involves in the formation of isoprenoids, terpenoids, and which also forms the steroids. Okay, so the shikimic acid involves in the synthesis of aromatic amino acids which ultimately gives the alkaloids, and acetyl CoA it involves in the acetate pathway, that is acetate malonate pathway and acetate mevalonate pathway. Acetate malonate pathway, it ultimately gives you the fatty acids and polyketides, and acetate mevalonate pathway, it helps in the synthesis of terpenoids, isoprenoids, steroids. And on the other hand, this acetyl-CoA, it also involves in the tricarboxylic acid cycle, TCA cycle. Okay, so which helps in the formation of amino acids, which also gives some of the alkaloids proteins. Okay, so and also nucleic acids. So this is a summary of all the three pathways which are there in our syllabus. Okay, shikimic acid pathway, acetate malonate pathway, acetate mevalonate pathway. Okay, so the same diagrammatic representation of all the pathways. Okay, so here you can see this is nothing but photosynthesis, right? Carbon dioxide and water, okay, forms the sugar, right? So here we have two pathways, glycolysis and pentose phosphate pathway, right? So here from pentose phosphate pathway we are getting an intermediate, that is erythrose 4-phosphate, and from glycolysis we are getting one more intermediate, that is phosphoenol pyruvate. These two undergoes condensation and forms the shikimic acid, and shikimic acid is an intermediate, right, of shikimic acid pathway, which ultimately gives you the aromatic amino acids along with coumarins, tannins, valine, lignin, flavonoids, phenyl propanoids, and other shikimic acid metabolites. Okay. On the other hand, the pyruvate, it also produces acetyl-CoA. So this acetyl-CoA, it forms acetate malonate, along with the malonyl CoA, it leads to acetate malonate pathway. Okay, so acetate malonate pathway. So here malonyl CoA is involved, right? So this ultimately helps in the biosynthesis of fatty acids and lipids. It includes fats as well as the both waxes. And on the other hand, with malonic acid, the acetyl-CoA, it involves in the acetate mevalonate pathway or mevalonic acid pathway. Okay, so acetyl-CoA along with malonic acid, it involves in the acetate mevalonate pathway, so which helps in the biosynthesis of isoprenoids. Okay, so these isoprenoids gives rise to both the terpenoids, squalene. From squalene you'll get the steroids, right? So on the other hand, we also have TCA cycle. The acetyl-CoA, it involves in the acetate mevalonate pathway, acetate malonate pathway, and also in tricarboxylic acid pathway, TCA. Okay, so from TCA or tricarboxylic acid cycle, we will get aliphatic compounds, proteins, and other alkaloids. Okay, so photosynthesis. Okay, so photosynthesis, we all know about photosynthesis. Okay, so the photosynthesis, basically it has three steps, that is energy is captured from the sunlight, right? The light energy is converted into chemical energy in the form of ATP and NADPH. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. Right? So the chemical energy is used to power the synthesis of organic molecules. Okay, so it utilizes carbon dioxide, water, and energy, and that energy is converted into ATP and NADPH. So in presence of these two, the carbon dioxide and water is converted into glucose molecules. Okay, these are the basic steps involved in the photosynthesis. Carbohydrate utilization. The primary and secondary metabolites are derived from the carbon metabolism. So here we already see. So here you can see these are nothing but carbohydrates, right? So from carbohydrates, again glycolysis, we are getting some intermediates, and from pentose phosphate pathway we are getting some other intermediates which are involving in the other biosynthetic pathways. Here also from glycolysis we are getting pyruvate. Pyruvate ultimately gives acetyl-CoA, so which involve in the acetate pathways. Okay, so the primary and secondary metabolites are derived from, they are ultimately derived from carbon metabolism. Difference, already we have seen the differences between the primary and secondary metabolites. Okay, so the basic mechanism or the basic three pathways which helps in the production of this primary and secondary metabolites are shikimic acid pathway, acetate malonate pathway, and acetate malonate pathway. Okay, so these three pathways we are going to discuss in our syllabus. Okay, so we'll continue in the next class.